On behalf of our head, Dr. Veronica Simon, who is currently off island, I wish to welcome all of you to the UWI Open Campus. The UWIOC is one of over 40 similar sites serving 17 Caribbean countries, which collectively make up the Open Campus, which is the fourth campus of our regional University of the West Indies. Tonight marks our second public lecture for 2016, and quite a departure from our last theme, which revolved around the ongoing debate over the legalization of marijuana, or the use of marijuana in St. Lucia. Our audience profile tonight is also very different from our last, a fact that we find very encouraging, as it means that we are achieving one of our major outreach goals of our monthly public lecture series, which is to allow public speakers, researchers, and scholars from varied disciplines of academia, the arts, and civil society to share their work and ideas with a broad cross-section of the public in a relaxed, friendly, and non-formal environment. Tonight, with the kind participation of Dr. Hamid Ghani of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, and the generous support of those persons who made his trip to St. Lucia possible, we present yet another topic that ought to be of concern to all St. Lucians, that of constitutional reform. Tonight, we are fortunate to have with us, in the person of Dr. Ghani, a presenter who is eminently qualified to discuss the differences between the major features of the Westminster-Whitehall constitutions of the Commonwealth Caribbean and the original UK Westminster model, leading to an understanding of the unique constitutional architecture that is our Commonwealth Caribbean constitutional landscape, exemplified in the legislatures, executives, and judiciaries of the region. Dr. Ghani will posit that it is these differences that explain why constitutional reform is often met with resistance when it is time for action, because what we have is indigenous by virtue of evolution and was not imported brand new at independence. At this time, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy two short introductory videos provided by Dr. Ghani to set the context for his lecture.
Jamaica was the happiest island in all the Caribbean. Kingston was in holiday mood, and the whole population hung out the flags and metaphorically threw its hat in the air. They rejoiced, not that they were parting from Britain, they are firm adherents of the Crown, but because Jamaica stood on the threshold of independence. And then it rained. A tropical downpour, as inappropriate as our own deluge on bank holiday. But nature relented, and as though to bid welcome, out came the sun as the airliner touched down at Palisadoes Airport, bringing to represent the Queen, Princess Margaret. Independence was to have a royal greeting. There to welcome the Princess and her husband was the Governor, Sir Kenneth Blackburn, and the veteran Prime Minister, Sir Alexander Bustamante. After the greeting of Lady Blackburn, it was the turn of the Premier to bid Her Royal Highness a loyal welcome. Then Princess Margaret was conducted to the saluting base to receive the royal salute by the Jamaica Regiment. The 12-mile drive from the airport and through Kingston gave thousands the opportunity they had long awaited to express their own greeting in unmistakable manner. At the entrance to King's House, the Princess spoke to some disabled children. Among them were Girl Guides and Boy Scouts. They are crippled, but they were not forgotten. The royal visitor had a word, too, with the woman in charge of them. Next day, Her Royal Highness opened the great National Stadium, which nobly expresses the pride and hope of the new nation. Sir Alexander Bustamante received the Princess and Lord Snowdon and conducted them to the royal box. This was the place where, at midnight on the following day, the flag of independent Jamaica would be raised. Princess Margaret said it was fitting that the country would serve as host for the 9th Central American and Caribbean Games. And after the applause came the emotional rendering of the Jamaican national anthem. The stage was now taken by the young people. Jamaica's youth organizations had heard the princess say that the country's future rested with their generation. They made it look as if that future would be in good hands. One spectator who had been among the prime movers in achieving independence was the opposition leader, Norman Manley. Two minutes to midnight, Sunday, August the 5th, the birth of Jamaican independence. The new flag was about to be hoisted over the stadium. Sir Kenneth Blackburn was soon to be Governor General, the higher rank in accord with the new status of Jamaica as full member of the Commonwealth. It is likely that before long he will be succeeded by a Jamaican, and who better than the 78-year-old Sir Alexander Bustamante. It was another historic day for the emergent nation that saw the state opening of Parliament. The motto chosen for the new coat of arms is, out of many, one people. And here on the Westminster model will sit the Democratic Assembly who will govern the multiracial 1.75 million who will become one people. On this moving occasion, it was Princess Margaret's privilege to represent Her Majesty the Queen. And as always, when such duty falls to her, she now performed it with a grace and dignity befitting the responsibility. In their places for the inauguration sat the 66 members of the Senate and House of Representatives. Visitors included the papal envoy and dignitaries from independent African states. It now fell to the Prime Minister to receive from the Queen's representative the constitutional instruments of Jamaican independence and to convey to the Princess the speech from the throne, in which the Queen congratulated all who had guided Jamaica to her new status and expressed hope in the nation's future progress and prosperity. The Prime Minister's address of thanks was seconded by the leader of the opposition, Mr. Norman Manley. The first session of Parliament of independent Jamaica was opened. It followed the pattern of Westminster, the mother of parliaments, from which democracy has spread and flowered in so many lands. 300 years of British government had come to an end, and peacefully, one more nation had been helped to achieve its yearning for self-government. All wish well to the happy people of independent Jamaica.
Her Royal Highness now hands over the constitutional instruments to the Prime Minister, who in turn replies.
May it please your Royal Highness, it is with a feeling of deep pride, pleasure and satisfaction as Prime Minister of the newly independent state of Trinidad and Tobago that I offer you for transmission to Her Majesty the Queen the profound thanks and appreciation of the government, Parliament and people of this country for Her Majesty's gracious message. We have looked forward with considerable pleasure to our entry into the Commonwealth family. Now that this goal has been achieved, I ask you to convey to Her Majesty an expression of our unfailing loyalty and devotion to her throne and person. We have been inspired by her good wishes, and we pledge ourselves to fulfill the promise expected of us, not only by Her Majesty, but by all the nations of the world, to show how our small community, with its people drawn from many lands of diverse racial origins, and subscribing to a variety of religious beliefs, can, in harmonious cooperation, make its contribution to the sum total of world peace, world progress, and world happiness. May I conclude by expressing the hope that this visit of yours to our shores, which is not the first, will certainly not be the last, and that we shall have on some future occasion the opportunity to display once more the esteem and affection in which you are held by the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and to demonstrate to you the contributions which we have set out to make to world democracy and to the defense and protection of human freedom.
The Leader of the Opposition, Dr. Capildeo, now speaks.
May it please Your Royal Highness to accept our sincerest thanks from this side of the House for the signal honor you have so graciously bestowed upon us by being present among us on this unforgettable occasion. It is fitting that at this historic moment, independence is heralded with the adornment and luster of British parliamentary democracy, and that it is dedicated to the British parliamentary tradition. Every such dedication is a barrier which evil minds will have to surmount in order to advance into totalitarian paths. Nevertheless, we enter the future with high hopes and with unbounded confidence in ourselves, we and the other side of the House.
The ceremony is ended. Parliament is inaugurated, and independent Trinidad and Tobago has become the 15th member of the Commonwealth of Nations. What now are our responsibilities?
The first responsibility that devolves upon you is the protection and promotion of your democracy. Democracy means more, much more, than the right to vote, and one vote for every man and every woman of the prescribed age. Democracy means recognition of the rights of others. Democracy means the equality of all in the eyes of the law. Democracy means equality of opportunity for all in education, in the public service, and in private employment. I repeat, and in private employment. Democracy means responsibility of the government to its citizens, the protection of the citizens from the exercise of arbitrary power and the violation of human freedom and individual rights. Democracy means freedom of worship for all and the subordination of the rights of any one race to the overriding right of the human race. Democracy means freedom of expression and assembly and organization. All that is democracy. All that is our democracy, to which I call upon all citizens to dedicate themselves on this our Independence Day. This is what I meant when I gave the nation as its slogan for all time: discipline, production, tolerance. Our national flag belongs to all citizens. Our national coat of arms with our national birds inscribed therein is the sacred trust of all our citizens. So it is today. Please, I urge you, let it always be so. Let us always be able to say with the psalmist, "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity."
Discipline, production, tolerance. These are our goals. Discipline, both personal and collective. Greater production at all levels. Tolerance of the other's point of view or religion or social custom.
I always enjoy returning to St. Lucia, as Mr. Ajamang so kindly mentioned. I've had a long relationship academically with St. Lucia in my work with the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College when I was Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. Tonight I'm here in a different capacity to talk about the Westminster-Whitehall model in the Commonwealth Caribbean and resistance to change. The Commonwealth Caribbean consists of Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Kitts, Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago. In the intervening years between 1962, when Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago attained their independence, and 1983, when St. Kitts Nevis attained its independence, it is to be noted that all of the constitutions of these countries resembled each other. This similarity between countries and the similarity of constitutional design has been referred to as the Westminster-Whitehall model in the Commonwealth Caribbean. An early definition of the Westminster model was given by the late Stanley de Smith in 1964 as follows. The Westminster model can be said to mean a constitutional system in which the head of state is not the effective head of government, in which the effective head of government is a prime minister presiding over a cabinet composed of ministers over whose appointment and removal he has at least a substantial measure of control, in which the effective executive branch of government is parliamentary, inasmuch as ministers must be members of the legislature, and in which ministers are collectively and individually responsible to a freely elected and representative legislature. Stanley de Smith, in his work, The Commonwealth and Its Constitutions, pages 77 to 78, published in 1964 by Stevens and Sons of London. This definition properly captures the kind of constitutional arrangements that were instituted in Commonwealth countries when they got their independence. The timeline of independence in the Commonwealth Caribbean is as follows. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, 1962. They were the first, and that's why I'd asked that those videos be played. Guyana, 1966. Barbados, 1966. The Bahamas, 1973. Grenada, 1974. Dominica, 1978. St. Lucia, 1979. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 1979. Belize, 1981. Antigua and Barbuda, 1981. And St. Kitts Nevis, 1983. The deviation in the constitutional design between these countries was minimal, with the most significant deviation being between those with bicameral, two-chamber, as opposed to unicameral, one-chamber legislatures. There are 8 bicameral and 4 unicameral legislatures in the Commonwealth Caribbean as follows. Bicameral, Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. Unicameral, Dominica, Guyana, St. Kitts Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Apart from this structural difference, the constitutions of all these countries at independence would have been described as being of Westminster stock. The definition applied by de Smith and the export of that model, as discussed by Alan Burns in his famous 1966 book, Parliament as an Export, published by George Allen and Unwin in London, 1966, would have suited the 1960s and 70s. This was an era when many new states gained their independence from Great Britain, and the composition of the Commonwealth assumed a greater developing world representation. At that time, it would have been too early to assess the impact and the significance of the constitutions that had been established in many of these newly independent states. However, by the late 1970s, doubts about the Westminster model and its export were being expressed. The late Freddie Madden, professorial fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, writing in a 1979 article entitled "Not for Export, the Westminster Model of Government and British Colonial Practice," in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, Volume 8, Number 1, pages 10 to 29, rejected in a general sense, the idea that the Westminster model could be exported and established overseas. Indeed, he argued that it was never the intention of British colonial administrators to export the model in its purest form. According to him, and I quote, "The only true Westminster model remained inevitably at home in Westminster. It was not intended for export, but was strictly to be consumed only on the premises." Page 24. This argument therefore begs the question that if the Westminster model was not exported, then what was? Madden never answered this question, but offers this opinion. Quote, The new generation of constitution makers in the 1950s and 1960s were not concerned with creating a permanent instrument for government, so much as a device for securing independence, which could be altered subsequently at will. Something akin to the British model might serve its temporary purpose in allaying fears in Britain about transferring power. But it remains to be proved that it is appropriate for the tasks of self-government anywhere else than in Britain, page 24. In 2012, both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago celebrated their 50th anniversaries of independence. And in 2016, Guyana and Barbados will celebrate their 50th anniversaries. The other countries of the region will follow in the years to come. So far, only 2 countries, Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, have undertaken any significant changes to their original independence constitution. The alterations were cosmetic for Guyana in 1970 and Trinidad and Tobago in 1976, as the fundamental parliamentary structure was retained. However, Guyana undertook significant reform in 1980 when a presidential model was introduced, and this was buttressed by further reforms in 2001. The constitutions of these countries in the Commonwealth Caribbean have been able to survive attempts to alter them subsequently at will, to the extent that the only other major attempt at reform failed at the referendum stage in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2009. Grenada will soon face its referendum later this year. The reality is that the Commonwealth Caribbean countries do not have a Westminster model. The late Leslie Wolfe Phillips, writing in 1984 in an article entitled, quote, "A Long Look at the British Constitution," unquote, in the journal Parliamentary Affairs, volume 37, number 4, pages 385 to 402, used the term Whitehall model to describe these constitutions. It would perhaps be more comfortable to describe these constitutions in the Commonwealth Caribbean countries, with the exception of Guyana, today as belonging to the Westminster-Whitehall model. Unlike the United Kingdom, which has an unwritten constitution, all of the countries of the Commonwealth Caribbean have written constitutions. The main features of the Westminster-Whitehall model are: 1, a unique bicameral system; 2, a Bill of Rights in the Constitution; 3, the codification of Westminster constitutional conventions; 4, a recently developed equivalence in the separation of powers; and 5, the entrenchment of constitutional articles. Let me start with the unique bicameral system. Of the 53 members of the Commonwealth, there are 18 bicameral national parliaments. 8 of those are to be found in the Commonwealth Caribbean. The members of the Senates in the Commonwealth Caribbean do not enjoy, I emphasize, do not enjoy security of tenure, like their senatorial colleagues in Canada or their noble colleagues in the House of Lords. Their appointments are made by the head of state on political advice or in the discretion of the head of state, as the case may be. Those appointments can be revoked at any time, and all senatorial positions become vacant at the next dissolution of Parliament. There is no guarantee of continuation of service beyond the dissolution unless there is an invitation on the basis of fresh political advice or favorable discretion from the head of state to continue in those constitutions where such an arrangement exists. The same political reality applies to those unicameral parliaments in the Commonwealth Caribbean that have nominated senators who sit side by side with elected MPs in Dominica, St. Kitts Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In the case of Guyana, there is a National Assembly that is elected on the basis of the party list system of proportional representation. Accordingly, their arrangements are defined for them on the basis of the will of the electorate and the decisions of political parties in the extraction of names from those lists to determine who sits in the National Assembly. There is no similarity with the Westminster model in the United Kingdom where this is concerned. The Bill of Rights and the Constitution. All of the constitutions of the Commonwealth Caribbean countries have a Bill of Rights in them, which is a chapter that recognizes, declares, and protects fundamental human rights and freedoms. In 11 countries, the Bill of Rights has been influenced by the European Convention on Human Rights 1950, while Trinidad and Tobago has been influenced by the Canadian Bill of Rights 1960. The constitutional effect of this is to permit the individual to challenge the state on the ground of human rights violations being a constitutional infringement. The courts are used as the vehicle of challenge, and the judiciary has the constitutional power to overturn executive or judicial action and parliamentary will in order to redress such infringements. Such powers are not exercised in the Westminster model in the United Kingdom, as the doctrine of the supremacy of Parliament operates in an environment in which there is no written constitution. The Commonwealth Caribbean is very different where these arrangements are concerned because of the existence of a written constitution when compared to the United Kingdom. We look at codification of Westminster constitutional conventions. Constitutional conventions largely provide the rules by which the affairs of state are conducted in the United Kingdom. Their transference to the constitutions of Commonwealth Caribbean countries at independence represents a desire to maintain, as far as possible, a reproduction of the Westminster model in the region. The best expression of this can be gleaned from the codification of Westminster constitutional conventions in the constitutions of these countries at the time of their independence. The only deviation that has occurred from this of any substance was the introduction of the Constitution of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana Act 1980, which completely altered the foundation of the Guyanese Constitution away from its previous Westminster-Whitehall base towards a presidential model. Despite its reform in 1976, the Trinidad and Tobago Republican Constitution that replaced its independence constitution retained most of the Westminster-Whitehall traditions and its parliamentary character. No other country in the Commonwealth Caribbean besides Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago has undertaken any similar systematic overhaul of its constitutional arrangements, and so the Westminster Conventions as codified remain as the basis for the operation of their political and constitutional systems. An example of the effect of codification of conventions can be seen in the fact that before the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011 in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister was able to advise the monarch on the date for a dissolution of Parliament. Of course, that is no longer so. One school of thought held that the monarch was obliged to accept the advice of the Prime Minister and implement the requested date. Another school of thought held that the monarch had a discretion to decide whether or not she would accept the requested date. As a consequence, there are two versions of this convention in circulation in the Commonwealth Caribbean. St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Belize have afforded the Governor General the right to refuse a prime ministerial request for dissolution, while 8 other countries grant the Prime Minister his or her request. Let's look at a recently developed equivalence in the separation of powers. The establishment of the United Kingdom's Supreme Court on the 1st of October 2009 created an equivalence between the separation of powers in Commonwealth Caribbean countries and the new Westminster model in the United Kingdom. And I emphasize the new Westminster model in the United Kingdom. No longer was the upper house of the British Parliament to serve as both a legislative and judicial body. This brought a measure of similarity between the House of Lords in its current form and the Senates in West Indian legislatures into harmony as legislative bodies exclusively. The revisions to the office of Lord Chancellor in the United Kingdom through the establishment of the offices of Lord Speaker and Secretary of State for Justice, together with the establishment of a new role for the Lord Chief Justice in the United Kingdom Supreme Court, has created a separation of powers that mirrors what exists in West Indian polities. There was never any equivalent office for the Lord Chancellor in West Indian jurisdictions, and that set the region apart from the Westminster model. Such a marked distinction was part of an analytical framework that would have been called the Westminster-Whitehall model or Whitehall model. Let me look at the entrenchment of constitutional articles. The concept of entrenchment is one that regulates the way in which Parliament exercises its legislative authority in respect of the amendment of the Constitution that guarantees its existence. There are three major types of entrenchment methods that are used in Commonwealth Caribbean legislatures. They are: 1, special majorities for bills seeking to amend the Constitution; 2, time delay mechanisms between the first and second readings of bills that seek to amend the Constitution; and 3, the use of post-parliamentary referenda to validate or reject amendments approved by Parliament. The constitutions of Barbados, Belize, and Trinidad and Tobago make no provision for a post-parliamentary referendum in the amendment of their constitutions. In relation to the use of time delay measures between the first and second readings of bills seeking to amend the Constitution, only the constitutions of the Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago make no provision in this regard. Needless to say, there is no comparison with the Westminster model in the United Kingdom on this subject, as there is no written British Constitution with articles in need of protection by entrenchment. Let me look at the pendulum of power between government and opposition. The Commonwealth Caribbean countries have largely chosen to have Westminster-style constitutions that are based on a majoritarian principle as opposed to the principle of consensus. Under such constitutional arrangements, the government and the opposition are expected to hold political power on an alternating basis, because the premise of that system of government is that electorates will change their minds in significant enough numbers to permit such a pendulum swing. The core of the argument is that political power is a zero-sum entity that must be transferred in its entirety from one side to the other, as there's no room for partial transfers of power. In other systems of government, political change is less of an expectation as opposed to political consensus, which must always be guaranteed. In such systems, power is shared by virtue of institutional arrangements that permit this on a consistent basis, so that changes in the control of the executive branch of government are not a zero-sum calculation that must also include the legislature. So the consensus models would be like the Washington model, where one party can control the White House and the other party can control the House and the Senate. That doesn't work in Commonwealth Caribbean democracies, which are majoritarian. Now, the model of consociationalism, as espoused by the political scientist Aaron Leipart in his famous 1999 book, Patterns of Democracy, published by Yale University Press, New Haven and London, embraces the notion of accommodative behavior among competing leaders in the political process. This model is designed to work in both majoritarian and consensual models, but the key to its success lies in the domain of the recognition of diversity and the development of political techniques to manage that diversity in order to maintain political stability. Essentially, Leipart is arguing that political elites can operate through back channels to ensure that there is stability in a society, despite the fact that they're opposed to each other. Waves of democratization. The political scientist Samuel Huntington writes in his 1991 book, The Third Wave, Democratization in the Late 20th Century, published by the University of Oklahoma Press, Norman and London, has argued that democracy can be measured globally in terms of waves. He demarcates these waves of democratization as follows: 1828 to 1926, first long wave of democratization; 1922 to 1942, first reverse wave; 1943 to 1962, second short wave of democratization; 1958 to 75, second reverse wave; 1974, until he wrote the book in 1991, third wave of democratization. Huntington places Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago in the period starting in the second wave, owing to their attainment of independence in 1962. He places Guyana in the second wave and also the second reverse wave, which he reserves for those countries that enter non-democratic phases after initially being democratic. However, the applicability of Huntington's theory about waves of democratization excludes many countries in the Commonwealth Caribbean. He recognizes the decolonization pattern as a central piece of his theory, but he uses the argument of size to eliminate many island nations from his analysis. According to him, and I quote, "A democratic country imposes democratic institutions on its colonies, the colony becomes independent and, unlike most former colonies, successfully maintains its democratic institutions. Papua New Guinea was one third-wave case. As Myron Weiner has pointed out, this pattern pertains primarily to former British colonies, most of which became independent in the second wave. Those left to become independent and democratic in the third wave were mostly small and mostly insular. They included Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Dominica, Kiribati, St. Christopher Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. With the possible exception of a very few remaining colonies, example Hong Kong, Gibraltar, the Falklands, of course Hong Kong became independent in 1999, he was writing in 91. These countries are the last legacy of the British Empire to democratization. Because of their small size, they are, unless stated to the contrary, excluded from analyses of third wave countries in this study, page 43. Now, this approach by Huntington represents a major deficiency in his methodology, as his findings about the third wave of democracy, as he calls it, would have been considerably strengthened if he had not engaged in such a deliberate omission. By eliminating Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Dominica, St. Christopher Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent the Grenadines, he has left a void in the analysis of democracy, separate and apart from his own findings, in the Commonwealth Caribbean that must now be challenged. Additionally, it should be noted that Huntington treats Grenada as if it were a country that had a communist regime in power all along, and that it experienced democratization during the third wave of democracy that he identifies as having started in 1974. Furthermore, his theory about Grenada is that it only experienced democracy as a result of violent external intervention during the third wave. According to him, quote, violent external intervention produced democracy in several cases, in the second wave, and in Grenada and Panama in the third wave, page 207. In addressing the need to challenge Huntington's theory in relation to the Commonwealth Caribbean, it is important to recognize the distinction between those states that were granted associated statehood in 1967 and subsequently determined their own termination of association with Great Britain, as opposed to those states that negotiated their independence with Great Britain. There is a qualitative difference between the associated statehood that was granted to Grenada, St. Vincent the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, and the then St. Kitts Nevis Anguilla in 1967, when compared to the manner in which Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Barbados, the Bahamas, and Belize attained their independence. The fundamental difference can be measured by the way in which the Colonial Laws Validity Act of 1865 was applied in the final stage before independence. Associated statehood saw the removal of the Colonial Laws Validity Act 1865 from applicability to the parliaments of those states that had this new status conferred upon them. With it went the doctrine of repugnancy, and these legislatures enjoyed a facility that other legislatures did not enjoy at a similar stage of their advance to full independence. That is, the right to enact legislation that could be repugnant to British law. Huntington's failure to include the large majority of Commonwealth Caribbean states in his analysis about waves of democratization in the world does not mean that his theory is not applicable to the region. He also established criteria by which the consolidation of democracy in any country can be measured, and for that he offers a particular test. The Commonwealth Caribbean has represented a virtual oasis of political stability when compared to other emerging democracies in Africa, Asia, and Central and South America. Apart from political abuses in Guyana under the Forbes-Burnham regime, 1964 to 83, and the overthrow of constitutional government in Grenada by Maurice Bishop, 1979, there have not been any other serious challenges to the political order in the region, and indeed the region has largely fitted into the waves of democratization that Huntington discussed in his 1991 book. However, the need to adjust his lack of theoretical application to the majority of Commonwealth Caribbean countries does not diminish the value of his theory as much as it represents an affront to the issue of small size as being valuable or relevant to political analysis. In spite of this, his development of a test to measure the consolidation of democracy by means of what he calls the two-turnover test is a useful yardstick by which to test Commonwealth Caribbean democracies. Let me look at the two-turnover test. According to him, quote, by this test, a democracy may be viewed as consolidated if the party or group that takes power in the initial election at the time of transition loses a subsequent election and turns over power to those election winners. And if those election winners then peacefully turn over power to the winners of a later election. Selecting rulers through elections is the heart of democracy. And democracy is real only if rulers are willing to give up power as a result of elections. Pages 266, 267. The clear implication of Huntington's theory is that one party that has power must be able to regain it peacefully after losing it peacefully for democracy to be consolidated. He goes further to say, quote, a second turnover shows two things. First, two major groups of political leaders in the society are sufficiently committed to democracy to surrender office and power after losing an election. Second, both elites and publics are operating within the democratic system. When things go wrong, you change the rulers, not the regime. Two turnovers is a tough test for democracy. The United States did not clearly meet it until the Jacksonian Democrats surrendered office to the Whigs in 1840, page 267. In the post-independence era in the Commonwealth Caribbean, all of the independent states have experienced two turnovers of government based on different political majorities by May 2015. The last country to satisfy the two-turnover test was the Cooperative Republic of Guyana in May 2015. Let us now try to understand our constitutional foundations in a society and region steeped in British traditions. Well, you would have seen the two videos at the start, so you get the drift of where this part of the lecture is going. At a public meeting on the 19th of July, 1955, in Woodford Square, Port of Spain, Trinidad, before he had entered electoral politics, Dr. Eric Williams said, and I quote, the colonial office does not need to examine its second-hand colonial constitutions. It has a constitution at hand which it can apply immediately to Trinidad and Tobago. That is the British Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you that the time has come when the British Constitution, suitably modified, can be applied to Trinidad and Tobago. After all, if the British Constitution is good enough for Great Britain, it should be good enough for Trinidad and Tobago. Taken from Eric Williams, Constitution Reform in Trinidad and Tobago, Public Affairs Pamphlet number 2, Teachers Educational and Cultural Association, Trinidad, 1955, at page 30. The views of Williams as expressed here openly contradict the intellectual line of argument that he developed in his famous work, Capitalism and Slavery, in which he challenged the very foundations upon which the philosophy of British trusteeship in the West Indies had been built. His central thesis was that the British government had not abolished slavery and the slave trade for humanitarian reasons, but rather for economic reasons, because the sugar industry was no longer economically profitable in this region for them. According to him, quote, the issues were not only the inhumanity of West Indian slavery, but the unprofitableness of West Indian monopoly, end of quote. Taken from Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, published by Andre Deutsch, London, 1964, page 188. The original book was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1944. The humanitarian argument had provided a view that British imperial policy could have been swayed by moral and humanitarian appeals to put an end to inequality, injustice, and exploitation that were the hallmarks of the colonial state. As a consequence, continued British trusteeship in the West Indies could therefore be trusted because of its genuine concern for the upliftment of the West Indian person. Williams's argument challenged all of that. However, his view of the British system of government can be seen as a contradiction of his views on British trusteeship and the end product of that trusteeship, which was fully responsible status, otherwise known as independence, with constitutional arrangements that reflected a suitably modified version of the British Constitution. What we must understand here is that Williams's advocacy of the British Constitution in a suitably modified format was his way of saying that the British constitutional formula was the one that we could adopt as our own because we did not have an indigenous system of government. Indeed, his entire stewardship as Chief Minister, Premier, and Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago represented a defense of the British Constitution, suitably modified. And when the greatest opportunity of all presented itself for constitution reform in 1971, when his People's National Movement, PNM, won all of the seats in the general election, he adopted the approach of engaging in a further suitable modification of the existing constitution, which was already a suitably modified version of the British Constitution. Now, Williams's manner of thinking can be contrasted with his colleague premier in Jamaica, Norman Manley, who had this to say in the Jamaican House of Representatives in January of 1962, and I quote, "Let us not make the mistake of describing as colonial institutions that are part and parcel of the heritage of this country. If we have any confidence in our own individuality and our own personality, we would absorb these things and incorporate them into our being and turn them to our own use as part of the heritage we are not ashamed of." Norman Manley, Proceedings of the Jamaican House of Representatives, 1961 to 62, 24th January 1962 at page 766. Norman Manley was not speaking about importing the British Constitution and converting it into local usage in the way that Williams had advocated, but rather he was urging that the existing institutions of the colonial era that evolved as part of Jamaica's development should not be regarded as colonial, but rather as indigenous. These institutions were installed as part of the colonial evolution, yet Norman Manley was describing it as a mistake to regard these institutions as being colonial. He preferred to bless them as being part of the heritage of Jamaica. The primary reason for my juxtaposition of these two views, as expressed by two leaders who were part of the independence movement some 50 years ago, will help us to understand the difficulties being experienced today with the prospect of constitution reform. Are we reforming constitutions that have been imported into our societies, or constitutions that are indigenous to our societies? For Williams, the argument was that if it was good enough for Great Britain, it would be good enough for Trinidad and Tobago. For Manley, it was not colonial, but rather part of the heritage of Jamaica. Somehow they both seem to be talking about the same thing. The only difference was that one argument advocated that what we have belongs to us by evolution, and the other argument is that what we have belongs to us by importation. The fundamental underlying question to be asked in both cases is whether there was widespread involvement of the population in the formulation of these constitutions, or whether this was an arrangement that suited the West Indian political elites as opposed to the West Indian populations themselves. In that context, the argument to be settled by constitutional reformers will be to find an answer to why would we want to change something that could be regarded as ours by evolution, or that has been adapted to suit our needs after importation. What are we searching for? Is it a desire to seek greater functional efficiency, to include the mantras of today that surround the usual suspects who go by the names of good governance, transparency, and accountability? Is it that we are wedded to the Westminister-Whitehall model of governance, and any alteration may only get as far as the creation of a hybrid by importing features that are genuinely alien to our heritage of the British Constitution, suitably modified, or our evolved colonial institutions that are supposedly part of our heritage? In a folio entry dated 2nd March 1962 for Mr. J.A. Peck, Assistant Legal Advisor at the Colonial Office, in the now declassified Colonial Office file CO 1031-3226, from Mr. J.E. Whiteleg at the West Indian Department, the following is noted. Now, I spent a lot of time for over many years going through archives in the National Archives in the UK and looking at declassified files. And in a lot of these old files, you know, the folio was on the left-hand side, all these long green pieces of paper, and they would write all these notes that referred to a piece of correspondence. So, this is a folio entry that I found in this particular file. Quote, Mr. Peck, Mr. Ellis Clark telephoned me today to say that the sources of the draft Trinidad Constitution are as follows. Citizenship, Sierra Leone with the proviso to Article 1.1 omitted and an entirely new Article 2.1. Human rights, Sierra Leone except the property article. Governor General, Sierra Leone. Parliament, present Trinidad provisions modified. Judicature, new form. Appeals to Her Majesty in Council, new form. Judicial and Legal Service Commission, based on Sierra Leone. Finance, common form provisions with modifications. Public Service Commission, new form. Police Service Commission, largely new form, but Nigeria provided the basis. Pension and miscellaneous provisions, common form modified, end of quote. At the time when this was written, Ellis Clark was on a visit to London in his capacity as constitutional advisor to the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago. The draft constitution for public comment had just been published in Trinidad and Tobago on 19th February 1962. So this is the 2nd of March. The draft constitution was published on the 19th of February 1962. What we get here are the sources that Ellis Clark used in drafting the constitution for public comment. The only originality in the document appears to have arisen in the sections on the judicature, appeals to Her Majesty in Council, and the Public Service Commission. In establishing the judiciary for Trinidad and Tobago in the Independence Constitution, Ellis Clark expressed the following views in a confidential explanatory memorandum to the Colonial Office, which has since been declassified. And I quote from that confidential memorandum, quote, provision is made in Section 8 of the Draft Order in Council for the Supreme Court, as constituted at present, to continue under the name of the High Court. The judges of the Supreme Court become the judges of the High Court and suffer no loss of status, emoluments, allowances, or else. It will be noted that no provision is made for the holder of the post of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The reason for this is that there will be no exactly comparable post on independence. The new post of Chief Justice in the draft constitution is a joint post of Chief Justice and President of the Court of Appeal. In his capacity as Chief Justice, the holder of that post is responsible for the administration of all the courts in the territory, from the lowest to the highest. As President of the Court of Appeal, he presides over the final court in Trinidad and Tobago. This is taken from the UK Archives, CO 1031-3226, explanatory memorandum by the Constitutional Advisor to the Cabinet on the draft Independence Constitution for Trinidad and Tobago. It is dated the 16th of April, 1962, and that quote was at page 9. In providing the insight into the creation of the post of Chief Justice at Independence, Ellis Clark outlined the intent of the draftsman as follows, quote, it will be observed that, in fact, the position of the Chief Justice and President of the Court of Appeal is more analogous to that of the Lord Chancellor in England than to that of the Lord Chief Justice. The Lord Chancellor presides over the House of Lords, the highest court in England, the ultimate court of appeal. He is also responsible for all judicial appointments, for the conferment of silk, etc. The Chief Justice and President of the Court of Appeal will preside over the final Court of Appeal in Trinidad and Tobago, and as Chairman of the Judicial and Legal Service Commission, will be largely responsible for judicial and other legal appointments. Same confidential memorandum, pages 9 to 10. These provisions were barely modified in the 1976 Republican Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, but the intent remains the same, with the new office of Chief Justice that was created at independence being both that of a jurist and an administrator. These provisions have been the source of great debate within and without the judiciary as regards the role, powers, and duties of the Chief Justice. In his explanatory memorandum on the draft Independence Constitution for Trinidad and Tobago, dated 16th April 1962, I quoted earlier, Ellis Clark had this to say, about the provisions created for the tenure of office of judges. Quote, perhaps the most important single feature which goes to ensure the independence of the judiciary and the attraction to the judiciary of the right type of judge is the security of tenure afforded to judges. For that reason, no attempt, I repeat, no attempt has been made in the draft constitution to be original. A formula carefully devised by the Colonial Office after many years as being the most likely to be effective and acceptable and yet not to derogate from the principles of independence has been adopted. It is word for word, I repeat that, it is word for word the formula that the Colonial Office was able to persuade Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Tanganyika to accept. There can be little doubt that it is what they would wish Trinidad and Tobago to accept. It's the same document, page 10. Ellis Clark reveals that the provisions regarding the tenure of office of judges in the Trinidad and Tobago Independence Constitution were virtually lifted word for word from the Independence Constitutions of Nigeria, 1960, Sierra Leone, 1961, and the then state of Tanganyika, 1961, which later became Tanzania. He, like Eric Williams, was confident that the population of Trinidad and Tobago would accept what the Colonial Office, he presumed, would want Trinidad and Tobago to accept. These provisions were essentially retained in the 1976 Republican Constitution, as the President has been substituted for the Governor General. Their intent, as devised by the Colonial Office in the 1960s, has never been changed. I turn now to the Washington model. Our geographical location in this hemisphere means that we are exposed to the Washington model as an alternative to the Westminster-Whitehall model. However, there appears to be a collective fear of moving too far from our Westminster-Whitehall moorings. Yet there is a deep-rooted desire to import certain aspects of the Washington model for the specific purpose of curbing the excesses of power enjoyed by those who hold office under the Westminster-Whitehall model. There has been particular concern in the region that our prime ministers are able to exercise tremendous power because the adaptations from the British system, in which there is a House of Commons of more than 600 members and a political culture that can function on the basis of an unwritten constitution, either were not comfortably transported across the ocean or have evolved differently in political systems where the size of the elected membership of parliaments may vary from 63 in Jamaica to 11 in St. Kitts and Nevis. The existence of royalty and nobility as part of the British system of government and the role that they play in the political culture as restraints on excessive uses or abuses of power do not have their equivalents in our traditions in the Commonwealth Caribbean. The political trust that accompanies the role of the sovereign in British politics is difficult to emulate elsewhere. In the absence of that trust, there is a growing desire to self-regulate the office of Prime Minister in the region by talking about term limits and fixed dates for elections. It does require some navigation of the parliamentary and presidential systems in order to insert those features to create the hybrid. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the power of dissolution was circumscribed in the Constitution Bill 2009, insofar as there was a proposal for no tendering of prime ministerial advice for 4 years and 9 months after Parliament held its first sitting. Within the remaining 3 months, the Prime Minister would have been free to advise a dissolution. Of course, provision was also made for the eventuality of a successful motion of no confidence, which could have resulted in an early general election. Unfortunately, these provisions, along with the rest of the draft constitution, were defeated in a referendum on that constitution in November 2009. In Jamaica, the parliament that was dissolved in December 2011, there was a bill that had been laid in the House of Representatives that sought to introduce term limits for the office of Prime Minister. The long title of the bill was, quote, "An Act to amend the Constitution of Jamaica to preclude appointment to the office of Prime Minister of a person who has previously held that office for a specified period," unquote. The intention of the bill was to amend Section 70 of the Jamaican Constitution, which reads as follows, Section 71. 70 subsection 1. Whenever the Governor General has occasion to appoint a Prime Minister, he, acting in his discretion, shall appoint the member of the House of Representatives who, in his judgment, is best able to command the confidence of a majority of the members of that House, and shall, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, appoint from among the members of the two Houses such number of other ministers as the Prime Minister may advise. End of quote. The amendment proposed to insert a subsection 1A and 1B after subsection 1 that was to read as follows, quote, 1A, a person shall not be appointed to the office of Prime Minister if he has held that office for periods, whether consecutive or not, which when added together total more than 9 years. 1B, a person appointed to the office of Prime Minister shall not be required to vacate office by reason only that, while in office, the period of his holding office, when added together with any previous periods of his holding office, total more than 9 years. End of quote. The Memorandum of Objects and Reasons attached to the bill by the then Minister of Justice, Dorothy Lightbourne, indicated that the government, quote, has taken a decision to amend the Constitution in order to limit the period of time for which a person may hold office as Prime Minister to periods, whether consecutive or not, which when added together do not exceed 9 years. However, an incumbent Prime Minister shall not be required to vacate his office by reason only of the fact that after his appointment, he exceeds the 9-year limit. End of quote. It is clear from this statement that the then Jamaican government was proposing to address the issue of term limits for the Prime Minister on the basis of time elapsed, as opposed to number of terms served. In parliamentary systems in the Commonwealth Caribbean, a term of office can be as little as 1 day to as much as 5 years and 3 months. St. Lucia is very familiar with this reality, having had 2 general elections in the month of April 1987. The period between the first and second general election would have constituted a term if the strict Washington model on term limits was to be applied. In this way, the proposed Jamaican legislation was attempting to get around the concept of the term that is used in the Washington model by adopting a formula that sought to permit someone to hold office for a possible period of up to approximately 14 years as the outer limit and 9 years as the inner limit. This would have constituted an adaptation of the Washington model concept of the 2-term limit into a Westminister-Whitehall model constitution such as Jamaica. Now, these forays into the domain of restricting prime ministerial power represented responses that have echoes in the wider society. In order to insert them, one must consider the overall political effect of the ripples that will flow outward once the original splash is made. The electorate in St. Vincent and the Grenadines did not accept the complete package that was laid before them in 2009. And there was a change of government in Jamaica after the general election of December 2011. So that the bill that sought to restrict the ability of someone to hold the office of Prime Minister to a cumulative time period did not advance itself through the Parliament. Perhaps the source of the desire to curb such executive power lies in our own attitudes to power and authority. The philosophy of servant leadership is under pressure from the concept of the German sociologist Max Weber, who spoke of, quote, the prestige feeling that power brings, end of quote. The former Jamaican Prime Minister, Michael Manley, writing in his book, The Politics of Change in 1974, had this to say about how the society perceived power and authority. Quote, to the Jamaicans' historical distrust of authority must be added the fact that all the institutions through which the newly freed slave, and indeed the entire society, began to attain social coherence were designed in the shadow of the Westminster model of democracy. Michael Manley, The Politics of Change, Andre Deutsch, London, 1974, page 29. Without the ability to handle power in a constructive manner as servant leaders, rather than as Weberian prestige seekers, the Caribbean finds itself saddled with a crisis of leadership where there is more talk than there is action that informs public policy implementation. As regards term limits and fixed dates for elections, that will obviously have to be a matter of wider debate in all of the countries of the region, as none of them have adopted that. Jamaica brought a bill to Parliament, and there was a change of government 1 year after the proposal for a prime ministerial term limit was laid in the House of Representatives. Trinidad and Tobago also brought constitutional reform legislation to Parliament in 2014 that sought to introduce a prime ministerial term limit, a runoff election for constituencies where no candidate won more than 50% of the votes cast, and a system of permitting constituents the opportunity to seek a recall of their MPs after 2.5 years of service in a 5-year term of office. There was fierce resistance to these measures from the then opposition. The essence of the argument against the runoff system was best captured by then opposition MP Colm Imber, when he said, and I quote, "And the countries that have it, like France, they have a presidential system, Mr. Speaker. They follow the Napoleonic Code. Their laws are not based on English common law. It is a completely different system. Yes, the entire court system, the judicial system, the administration of justice, they are based on that Napoleonic Code, completely different to our English common law system." Taken from the Hansard, Trinidad and Tobago House of Representatives, 11th of August 2014 at page 336. The Constitution Amendment Bill was passed in the House of Representatives, and later it was passed in the Senate with amendments. However, the Senate amendments were never ratified by the House of Representatives by the time the Parliament was dissolved in June 2015 and the bill lapsed. In delving into an understanding of the resistance to the amendment, the contrast between the Napoleonic Code and English common law as a basis for not making the change reveals a deep desire to retain English common law. That is one of the sources of resistance to change where our constitutions are concerned. In many respects, this line of argument buttresses the admiration shown by Eric Williams for the British Constitution in 1955, insofar as it posits that our constitutional foundation is decidedly based on English common law and should not be altered in any form or fashion to disturb that. Guyana is the only country in the region that has introduced term limits by post-independence constitutional reform, while the quasi-ceremonial president of Dominica has been limited since independence to 2 5-year terms and not the Prime Minister of Dominica. However, Guyana has a presidential system which lends itself more easily to term limits as opposed to parliamentary systems. Former President Bharat Jagdeo was the first person to give effect to the term limit when he was constitutionally debarred from seeking election for a 3rd term as President of Guyana in 2011. Essentially, in the Commonwealth Caribbean, there are functioning democracies that have experienced political change because of the will of the electorate. Caribbean populations have given 2nd and 3rd chances to prime ministers in the region, such as Errol Barrow, 1961 to 76, and 1986-87, Michael Manley, 1972 to 80, and 1989 to 93, Sir John Compton, 1974 to 79, 1982 to 1997, and 2006-2007, Patrick Manning, 1991 to 95, and 2001 to 2010, George Price, 1961 to 1984, and 1989 to 1993, Sir Manuel Esquivel, 1984 to 1989, and 1993 to 1998, Hubert Ingram, 1992 to 2002, and 2007 to 2012, Perry Christie, 2002 to 2007, and since 2012, Dr. Kenny Anthony, 1997 to 2006, and since 2011, Dr. Keith Mitchell, 1995 to 2008, and since 2013, Portia Simpson Miller, 2006 to 2007, and 2012 to 2016, and Andrew Holness, October to December 2011, and since March 2016. As the region continues to emerge from independence, the reality is that more and more political leaders will possibly get 2nd and 3rd chances at holding the reins of power. The Westminster-Whitehall model is based on the philosophy of the rotation of power and not the principle of power sharing. This means that political change happens largely by virtue of the will of the population, except in cases of hung parliaments. I turn now to independence for St. Lucia. In respect of the termination of association of St. Lucia from Great Britain, there was no revolutionary struggle for independence. The deliberations of the British cabinet revealed that there was no likelihood of any difficulties, but the British government were prepared one way or the other. According to the now declassified cabinet conclusions of the Jim Callaghan cabinet on Thursday, 30th November 1978, the issue of independence for St. Lucia was summed up in the following way, quote, "The Prime Minister said that the Defense and Overseas Policy Committee was considering proposals for the grant of independence to St. Lucia. Both the government of St. Lucia and the opposition were in favor of the principle of independence, but the opposition were arguing that the people of St. Lucia should first be consulted directly in an election. It was not, however, expected that the opposition would resort to violence if independence was granted without an election. But even so, the possibility of having a Royal Navy ship close at hand as a precautionary measure at the time was being examined." End of quote. And that is taken from the 41st Cabinet Conclusions for 1978 at page 3. In fact, the key issues to be determined were whether there should be an election before the grant of independence and whether or not the government's legislative timetable could accommodate the completion of the process before the Christmas recess. Both matters were resolved favorably in the sense that there was no general election before independence and the British government completed the legislative process before the Christmas recess of December 1978. What also had to be considered was the fixing of an independence date, and this was determined by the Premier John Compton as the following declassified confidential telegram on the subject dated 4th December 1978 from C.G. Mortlock, Deputy British Government Representative, resident in St. Lucia, to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, stated, quote, "St. Lucia Independence. 1. I saw Premier Compton this afternoon and delivered Mr. Rowland's message. Compton was delighted and asked that his appreciation and gratitude for this quick response be conveyed to the Minister. 2. Without any hesitation, he nominated Thursday, 22nd February as Independence Day." End of quote. Taken from UK National Archives in the file FCO 44, 1910 at folio 418. Without any difficulty, all aspects of St. Lucia's independence were determined by December 1978, and Independence Day was set for 22nd February 1979. On the 28th of March 1979, just over a month later, the government of Prime Minister James Callaghan fell in a motion of no confidence in the House of Commons by a margin of 310 to 311. General elections were held in the United Kingdom on the 3rd of May 1979, and the Conservative Party, led by Margaret Thatcher, came to power. If there had been a delay in St. Lucia over the issue of independence, it is quite possible that it could have had to wait until the political uncertainty in Great Britain had been resolved before it proceeded to its own independence. The actual procedure that was followed by the British government in granting independence to St. Lucia is best captured in the following response to a question for written answer in the House of Commons on the 6th of December 1978. Quote, "Mr. Boothroyd asked the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs if he will make a statement on the termination of the status of association between St. Lucia and the United Kingdom. Mr. Ted Rowlands, the government have decided to recommend to Parliament that the status of association be terminated by order in council under section 10 subsection 2 of the West Indies Act, with effect from 22nd February 1979. Copies of the proposed independence constitution are being made available in the library of the House." End of quote. Taken from House of Commons, Hansard, Written Answers, volume 959, page 709, 6th December 1978. This answer by the Minister of State in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Ted Rowlands, was given just 2 days after Premier John Compton had told the Deputy British Government Representative in St. Lucia of his desire for 22nd February 1979 to be Independence Day. The St. Lucia Termination of Association Order 1978, SI 1978, number 1900, and the St. Lucia Constitution Order 1978, SI 1978, number 1901, were both made on 20th December 1978, and both came into effect on 22nd of February 1978. I turn now to the CCJ and the Privy Council. The issue of the retention of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council to the exclusion of the Caribbean Court of Justice raises issues of status and identity, and some of the very judges of the CCJ pride themselves on their knighthoods and membership of Her Majesty's Privy Council, while imploring countries that have not made the change to complete the cycle of their independence by joining the CCJ. The knighthood has become the gold standard of Caribbean honor, to which many persons aspire. The anti-colonial movement examines issues like membership of the CCJ, but it never goes deeper to examine the West Indian psyche to understand the contradiction between asserting West Indian nationhood alongside the reverence for British honors and royalty. Perhaps that is the true underlying identity of the region, and we are struggling to seek to reform constitutional systems that we really do not want to change substantially because they're not alien to us, either by virtue of evolution or suitably adapted importation. The following is a list of members of Her Majesty's Privy Council from the Commonwealth Caribbean as at the end of January 2015. Mr. Owen Arthur, Mr. Michael de Labastide, Sir Nicholas Braffett, Sir Dennis Byron, Mr. Perry Christie, Dr. Denzel Douglas, Sir Manuel Esquivel, Mr. Hubert Ingram, Sir James Mitchell, Dr. Keith Mitchell, Mr. Saeed Musa, Mr. P.J. Patterson, Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, Mr. Edward Siaga, Sir Kennedy Simmons, Mr. Frundell Stewart, and Sir Edward Zacher. It's taken from David Rogers by royal appointment, published by Back Publishing, London 2015, Appendix F, 325 to 332, this book. The recent announcement from St. Kitts Nevis in January 2016 that the government is considering the issue of accession to the appellate jurisdiction of the Caribbean Court of Justice is duly noted in the public domain. The CCJ continues to assert that countries joining it will, quote, complete the cycle of their independence, unquote, upon severing their link with Her Majesty's Privy Council. I have challenged the CCJ on this point publicly, on the ground that a convention has arisen that the Chief Justice of the CCJ becomes a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council. The basis of my argument is based on the fact that both Michael de Labastide and Sir Dennis Byron became members of Her Majesty's Privy Council in 2004, just prior to the CCJ coming into existence. For me, where a conundrum arises is in the conflict between asserting the severing of the links of countries from their recognition of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as their final court of appeal, while the Chief Justices of the CCJ, past and present, have retained personal links as members of Her Majesty's Privy Council. How do you lobby for termination of the link to the Privy Council while retaining your personal membership of the very same body, having regard to the nature of the oath that is taken by anyone who becomes a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council? Everyone who becomes a member of the Privy Council recites the following oath. Quote, "You do swear by Almighty God to be a true and faithful servant unto the Queen's Majesty as one of Her Majesty's Privy Council. You will not know or understand of any manner or thing to be attempted, done or spoken against Her Majesty's person, honor, crown, or dignity royal, but you will let and withstand the same to the uttermost of your power, and either cause it to be revealed to Her Majesty herself, or to such of Her Privy Council as shall advertise Her Majesty of the same. You will in all things to be moved, treated, and debated in council, faithfully and truly declare your mind and opinion, according to your heart and conscience, and you will keep secret all matters committed and revealed unto you, or that shall be treated of secretly in council. And if any of the said treaties or councils shall touch any of the councillors, you will not reveal it unto him, but will keep the same until such time as, by the consent of Her Majesty or of the council, publication shall be made thereof. You will to your uttermost bear faith and allegiance unto the Queen's Majesty, and will assist and defend all jurisdictions, preeminences, and authorities granted to Her Majesty and annexed to the Crown by acts of Parliament or otherwise, against all foreign princes, persons, prelates, states, or potentates, and generally in all things you will do as a faithful and true servant ought to do to Her Majesty. So help you God. And that's the end of the quote. From David Rogers, by royal appointment, Bite Back Publishing, London, 2015, pages 2 and 3, which is this book. The revelation of the oath of a Privy Councillor by Rogers in his book has unearthed the dimension and scope of the duty of personal loyalty to Her Majesty that must be undertaken by anyone who takes that oath. Without the oath, you cannot become a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council. It has been publicly advertised that both Michael de Labastide and Sir Dennis Byron are members of Her Majesty's Privy Council. At the same time, the former was, and the latter is, the Chief Justice of the Caribbean Court of Justice. According to the CCJ website, I repeat that, according to the CCJ website, the following is stated about the first Chief Justice, Mr. Michael de Labastide. Quote, he was sworn in as a member of the Privy Council by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on 27 July 2004, and as President of the Caribbean Court of Justice on 18th August 2004. End of quote. That's on the CCJ website. The position of the CCJ is that the independent countries of the Commonwealth Caribbean should complete the cycle of their independence by severing links with the Privy Council and adopting the CCJ as their final court of appeal. I have been involved in the drafting of 2 constitutions that call for the CCJ to become the final court of appeal for Commonwealth Caribbean societies. The Principles of Fairness Constitution in 2006 in Trinidad and Tobago, co-drafted with the late Tajmul Hussain QC, and the St. Vincent and the Grenadines 2009 draft constitution, co-drafted with Dr. Francis Alexis. However, I have simultaneously led the charge against the argument being advanced by some judges of the CCJ and others in the legal and academic professions who argue that we need the CCJ to complete the cycle of our independence, when that is patently not so. The harsh reality is that there is a colonial mindset running parallel to the Caribbean Court of Justice. Before I started raising this issue in April 2014, the CCJ website had this to say about its current Chief Justice, the Right Honorable Sir Dennis Byron, and I quote, in 2000, Mr. Justice Byron was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, and he was appointed a member of the Privy Council in 2004. That sentence has now been removed from the CCJ website in relation to Sir Dennis, but it does not remove the reality that our CCJ Chief Justice is a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council. The reference to Michael de Labastide has remained unchanged. In an interview with reporter Andre Bagou of the Sunday Newsday in Trinidad and Tobago, published on 12 April 2015, the Right Honorable Sir Dennis Byron had this to say, quote, ending all vestiges of colonialism is good for us as a people and our societies, he said. The Privy Council is a remaining vestige of colonialism, which undermines our independence as a people and as a community. It is an anachronism. It's time that it should no longer serve us, end of quote. Is this really the issue? Or is the issue one that the CCJ can deliver a more efficient judicial service to the region? Quite frankly, by trying to go the anti-colonial route, those judges of the CCJ who have decided to emulate the role of the politician in their public advocacy have walked into an intellectual minefield of their own making. The identity of many parts of the Commonwealth Caribbean is deeply connected to the British honours system, and personal loyalty and devotion to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II is a hallmark of many of our political and judicial elites. It is very difficult for them to make that anti-colonial argument and retain their titles at the same time. How does one interpret that part of the oath of a Privy Councillor that says, quote, you will to your uttermost bear faith and allegiance unto the Queen's Majesty, and will assist and defend all jurisdictions, preeminences, and authorities granted to Her Majesty and annexed to the Crown by acts of Parliament or otherwise, against all foreign princes, persons, prelates, states, or potentates, and generally in all things you will do as a faithful and true servant ought to do to Her Majesty, so help you God. This will require further research and investigation now that it has been revealed, because I only found this out last November when I bought this book in the UK, and this is a very recent publication. It will be difficult for anyone who has taken that oath to speak out publicly about any interpretation of the oath itself because of the personal burden of secrecy imposed upon such a person. However, as a region coming to terms with the narrative of the court to complete the cycle of independence by severing our links to the Privy Council, it is something about which we must pause and consider. Is it possible that a Privy Councillor can resign their membership of the Privy Council? According to Rogers, in this book, quote, being able to resign was a new development, and it is still questionable whether this is constitutionally correct, end of quote, page 10. The CCJ has to answer why it is necessary for its President and Chief Justice to be made a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council. This question has been raised before, and there continues to be a stony silence from the CCJ on the subject. The CCJ is asking Commonwealth Caribbean citizens and their governments to terminate the link with the Privy Council, yet we cannot get an answer as to why it is necessary for the Chief Justice of the CCJ to be a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council. They criticize the British colonial connection and ask us to let it go, while they cling firmly to it and cannot tell us why. My conclusion. The prognosis on constitutional reform in the region is that we appear to be quite content with the system of government that we have. The talk about change is caught in a web of advocacy about severing links with the colonial mother country by political and other elites who rarely derive their social and political recognition from the British honours system. Furthermore, independence came to the region because of the collapse of the West Indian Federation and not because of any revolutionary struggle. Whether you accept the quote from Eric Williams of 19 July 1955 that I referenced at the start of this lecture, in which Williams said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you that the time has come when the British Constitution, suitably modified, can be applied to Trinidad and Tobago. After all, if the British Constitution is good enough for Great Britain, it should be good enough for Trinidad and Tobago." Or whether you accept the statement made by Norman Manley in the Jamaican House of Representatives on 24 January 1962, in which he said, "Let us not make the mistake of describing as colonial institutions which are part and parcel of the heritage of this country. If we have any confidence in our own individuality and our own personality, we would absorb these things and incorporate them into our being and turn them to our own use as part of the heritage we are not ashamed of." The reality is that there is a natural organic link between our CCJ and the Privy Council, insofar as knighthoods and membership of Her Majesty's Privy Council are concerned. Additionally, many of our prime ministers have also accepted the membership of Her Majesty's Privy Council. Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados and St. Lucia have instituted their own national awards, which now have locally created knighthoods as their highest awards. The conferment of the titles of Sir and Dame have continued along the path outlined by Norman Manley some 54 years ago in Jamaica, to the extent that the evolutionary process has now made knighthoods part of the local recognition for national awards. The oath of office for a Privy Councillor is indeed very burdensome on the individual to protect the person of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and her successors. We argue about this matter without recognizing the natural, organic connection between the two. We live in a region whose identity is defined by its connection to the British honours system. Whether you take the Williams narrative of 1955 or the Manley corollary of 1962, these statements are not made in any form or fashion to be insulting to anyone, but rather are designed to present the cold, hard facts about understanding that we are trying to reform constitutions that might actually be indigenous rather than imported. If we argue that they are imported, then perhaps we've modified them enough to make them suitable for our purposes. Is constitutional reform a complaint against the way that things work? In which case, every change of government brings with it an answer to the complaints. Or is constitutional reform a complaint against the foundation of the state that has either been imported from the British to be modified by us, or has been there an evolutionary process in its own peculiar way from our native soil, and it really belongs to us and is not that alien after all? I hope I've left you some food for thought and reflection, and I thank you.
As the evening's proceedings draw to a close, it is my pleasure to move the vote of thanks in appreciation of all those persons who made tonight's event possible. First of all, I wish to extend our thanks to Your Excellency for your unwavering support of our events. No matter how busy or exhausting your schedule, somehow you always find time to support the work that we do here at the Open Campus, and for that, we are so grateful. Thank you also to our guest lecturer, Dr. Ghani. As expected, yours was a very engaging lecture, which gave us much food for thought. Thank you also for so readily agreeing to deliver this lecture when approached by Dr. Simon. She missed quite a treat, but along with the wider public, still have the opportunity to view it via our alumni YouTube channel and hopefully on television also. Even before the lecture, RSL already placed a request for a recording, so we know the interest is out there, and we'll be sure to circulate it when ready. The UE Open Campus St. Lucia also wishes to extend a very special word of appreciation to those companies whose generous support made tonight's lecture possible, namely Thaddeus M. Antoine and Partners, Peter I. Foster and Associates, and George and Company Chambers. Thank you, sirs, for coming on board and at a relatively short notice and without hesitation to support our efforts. We are very grateful. Thank you also to Dr. Rosemary Husbands-Mathre and Mr. Solomon Ajiman for your role in tonight's proceedings. Teamwork always makes everything that much easier. Which leads us to the next group to be thanked, namely the staff of the UE Open Campus for the contribution in preparing for tonight's lecturer, from setting up the room to preparing the programs and providing the necessary technical expertise. They can always be depended upon for the support. We appreciate you.